Hello and welcome to the latest edition of How Might We? And today I'm joined by Geoff Hudson Searle and David Frost. And the topic of conversation is how might we lead through times of geopolitical tension, which I'm assuming you all realise we're in at the moment. So, welcome, gentlemen. Geoff, as you're a regular
Hello.
on this, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Exactly, no problem at all. Thank you, Scott. It's a great pleasure to be here with yourself and David. My name is Geoff Hudson Searle. I'm a 30-year international executive, C-suite executive on both public and private listed companies, non-executive director, and also CEO of IBM Golf and IBM Group here in the UAE.
Thank you very much. And young David.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks for that, Jeff. Yeah, my name is David Frost. I've been doing a combination of talent leadership development in global organizations and hypergrowth startup companies for about 20 years. I've been in the epicenter of a number of geopolitical and country crises over the years. So really interesting and quite a personal topic for me today.
Okay, thank you and welcome, gents. So, obviously, where you guys are, you're both from, if correct me if I'm wrong, but they're both in the UAE at the moment. Jeff, I know
We
you are.
are.
Yep.
We are indeed, yes.
So obviously, the things that have gone on with Iran and America and Israel at the moment has a impact on the region. So, how do you think what's happening now with the geopolitical tensions that we've had, not just with Iran, but obviously over the last 10, probably 15 years now, um, and leadership is important through these stages?
Yeah, I think if I start with that, if that's okay. I don't think you're identifying what I would consider to be one event. I don't think, if you look at the history of the world today, you'll start to look at a series of different events. We could look at Spanish flu as an example. We could look at SARS. We could look at COVID-19, which we're all very familiar with. These are events, and even though we're talking about geopolitical tension and we're talking about potentially strategies, and we're actually talking about boards actually supporting the C-suite and in regards to what is going on at the moment. It's potentially just another event. Now, what we have when we have events like this is, misinformations, no proper strategic frameworks, and there's no big surprise that we have trust issues and we have a greater fragmentation of trust as a direct result of actually not communicating effective critical information, which, as far as I'm concerned, is not critical, it's mission critical when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of people from different continents and around the world. It doesn't, what you said earlier, it doesn't just affect the Iran position and or in the GCC position. Whether we like it or not, it affects the whole world, whether you're 500 miles away from the situation, or whether you're actually 5,000 miles away from the situation, you're involved because economically, trust breaks down, economics break down, people break down.
So, David, before
Mm,
we came on air, we said that a lot of the stuff that obviously, as Jeff said, these are the impacts that we have now, but for organizations, the
mm.
preparation and dealing with this should be happening way before potential events happen.
Yeah, yeah, 1,000%. I just want to build on what Jeff said. I think he's absolutely right. This is another event, and we've seen many of these through different iterations over the last 10, 15 years for sure. So this concept of black swan thinking, it's not new in the boardroom, it's not new in executive teams. I think the the reality is that most organizations very quickly um, desire, for a number of reasons, to go back to BAU, and often that's really misguided. Jeff's also right that because we live in such an interconnected world like never before, you could be in Arizona or Addis Ababa or Abu Dhabi. And what's happening here does have an impact in people's professional lives, their economic lives, their personal lives. It really does have an impact. And the misinformation effect is actually quite profound. Geoff and I both speak to people globally. I was speaking to somebody in Connecticut yesterday, and the power of misinformation, even for some very, very smart people, is quite overwhelming. And when we think about what all of this means for leaders, for executives, for people working in organizations, large and small, is that we need clarity, we need trust, and the seeds of that are not often sown effectively or strongly enough in until it's too late, because the brutal truth about an event or situation like we've got in the Gulf at the moment is it really does throw an organization's leadership into the spotlight. And it does that for a number of reasons, I think. Because at any time of crisis, people look for meaning, they look for purpose, they look for direction. They're often looking for some kind of insurance that everything's going to be okay. And where we see people being failed or institutions falling short, the expectations, the need for that assurance, that leadership that we don't often get sometimes from governments or other institutions, we really and it's a very human thing to look for the next source of that assurance or that responsibility. It shifts very much to our organization's leadership. And the reality is that a lot of organizations at the moment are missing the opportunity. There is a desire to return to normal. Newsflash, normal doesn't really exist. But I think
I think what you're saying about the newsflash, I think is really interesting because, as
yeah.
you know, David, we're here in the UAE, and the first thing is we trust this government because this government
Mm,
actually is one government that executes on its vision, it executes on its strategy, and there is a really lovely, warming sensation about knowing that you're cared for. And I want to use the word empathy. I want to use the word compassionate and caring for the people here, and of which I feel, and you definitely feel, and we are included within that. But you make a very good point, and I guess I wouldn't mind debating with you on this
mhm.
point, and that point is the cost of confidence, right? Because
Okay.
as you said, the from Europe, from Western Europe, as an example, or Northern Europe, in fact. Um, I've had in excess of 1,000 messages in the last 2 weeks, and that's actually cost me a tremendous amount of time, and my fingers have got pretty damaged from
Mhm,
response. I'm saying
mhm,
everything is fine, right?
mhm.
Everything is fine. But the point is the scaremongering that's going on. I mean, serious reporting, right?
Yeah.
And it requires serious journalism. Otherwise, all you're going to create is this social withdrawal. And the cost of social withdrawal from the restaurants, from the attractions, from the nightlife, from the everyday existence and the coffee shops and everything we do on a daily basis. We saw in COVID, right? I
Mhm.
mean, we
Yeah.
saw it in COVID. I mean, I remember I also, to be fair, the big debacle before that was 9/11 New York. I mean, I was in New York. Thank God I was actually in Midtown when the whole situation happened. But it started to put scaremongering and fear and anxiety into the eyes of people. And then from a
Mhm,
leadership perspective, leaders didn't really know how to react to 9/11. Actually, leaders didn't know how to react to COVID. They thought
mhm.
being a sensible leader was sending a box of bananas to their staff on a Friday afternoon. I mean, no disrespect, but that is not leadership, and that is certainly not empathy or compassion, right? So,
Mm,
I think there were some learnings, and I go back to I want to be quite inspiring here, because one of the things that we're very fortunate, David, both you and I, to have in this part of the world is that we have this positivity and this energy, right?
Mm.
And if you look back at COVID, and I was in the UK when that broke out, there was all of this toxic kind of negativity, and there's nothing really positive you can do in that environment in any circumstances. And the clever entrepreneurs and the clever leaders were looking outside of the box, and they weren't looking at risk. They were looking at the risk for opportunity rather than the
Yeah.
risk for failure, right? And
Yeah.
and I think that in any kind of event, this one included, as I said, it's back to that confidence level. I mean, as I said, Carol Dweck, she wrote the book Mindset, which is a absolutely fabulous book. But really, what it defines is two sets of people. The low growth, the toxic environment, and
Mm.
the inability to collaborate, to trust, and to grow, versus the high performance, high growth mindset,
Yeah.
which is based on positivity, inspired visions, and execution, right? And I guess where I'm really going with this is that this is the kind of leadership, and no big surprise that 56 years ago in the Middle East, there was a lot of resiliency. There was a lot of building an environment on sand, no oil, turning this into one of the largest global economies in the world. And even through this period, I mean, I've been spending time in places like Jumeirah through some of the celebrations, and you're listening to, people like Bank Investment Properties, 80 billion in retail property sales last year, and they believe that this year is going to be bigger, irrespective of the events that have taken place. So I think there's a lot of semistic views around the Middle East, and most people don't even understand the Middle East. I think really what I'm really trying to say is leadership has got a big responsibility to its employees, to its people, to its investors, and to its shareholders, right? And to members of the board. But even with the members of the board and even with the C-suite, they have to be rewired to actually
Yeah.
understand the dynamics that are going on at the moment. But more importantly, what are the prevention strategies, and what are the out of the box thinking are they going to come up with to make
Mm.
sure not only are they rewired, but they have the skills, attributes, beliefs to be able to drive organizations forward? Because some of the failure in leadership is very much because they don't have the competency, they don't have the skills,
Yeah.
and they don't,
Yeah.
and there's not the right balance of people making really good informed decisions. And I blame technology to a certain degree as a part of that, because I've always believed that it's not about just technology, it's people, technology, and process that's required with leadership, and it needs to be driven in the right way. And I think right now we're coming to a crisis of not having change, transformation, but not having rewired leadership in the right positions of authority that can react quick enough to take advantage of those opportunities that you quite rightly describe.
It's interesting what you say, Jeff, because over the last, I'd say 3, 4 days, I've had a number of conversations with leaders in the region, people in my personal life, and there are some parallels from COVID in particular. And I remember when I was in London, in the city in London when COVID hit, and it was a very uncertain thing. It was global. We had the daily briefings from the government, and it was a very, very unusual, disconcerting time. And some of the lessons that I learned from that is the best companies and the best leadership teams, even those that were caught completely out of the blue, the leadership teams stuck or understood one very, very simple maxim, is that you manage things, but you lead people. And they, the most successful leadership teams and companies really owned that. And that was about their identity as leadership teams. It wasn't just a case of putting processes in for people coming into the office, location or BCP, business continuity planning type activity. It was about using it as an opportunity to bring the organization closer together, to focus on what really mattered, putting in processes, structures that connected people in more meaningful ways than they ever had previously. Now, the interesting thing about the Middle East at the moment, which is not being reported, by the way, is that ultimately confidence is key. We know that. Dubai is a bit quieter. Other areas of the Middle East, major cities in the Middle East, are quieter, but they're also quietly confident. So people that I know, that you know, who've been in the region for quite some time, they've built their resilience through some of the challenges, Gulf wars in the past, the Iraq wars, COVID, Ukraine. We're a much more globalized world now, and they've been through that. And that's not to diminish everything that is happening at the moment. But of course, there are people, people that we know who are very dear to us, that this is the first time they're going through anything like this. And a big source of building their confidence is really down to the people that they spend time with, and that's obviously in the organizations in which they work, which are governed by leadership teams. And in my estimation, there are a number of things and a number of things that lessons that I learned when I went through COVID. Of course, I was at Boeing during one of the most turbulent periods of their history, and I think you've got to be honest about what the crisis really means for your organization, because a true crisis, it doesn't just test your organization, it reveals it. And there's one consistent truth that really comes to me, and that's the organizations that see that it is time to step up, that it's time to understand and own the situation as much as they can, but to be brave and lead with courage. And I really believe that, because
I like that.
taking
I like that leading with courage, David, a lot. And I like
yeah
it because it talks to me, because it really says that if we all talk about being courageous and courage. We all talk about resiliency. But if you've got trust within the organization, you can build, if you've got resiliency within the organization, you've got
mhm,
trust. And then effectively, you're going to have more trust, because resiliency is the very glue at the center of culture. And this part of the world, one thing it's very good at is innovating, and more importantly, driving innovation. Technology is a very good example of that. But one of the things that really hasn't changed that much, because you and I mean, I'm sure I certainly follow the global leadership reports by PwC, by McKinsey, by Bain, by Boston. And it just seems that the same percentages still come out. And when I mean percentages, there are people that can maintain a business and sustain it to a certain level. But there are very few people that can actually develop, innovate, and more importantly, pivot and grow within an organization, because it's a different set of skill sets. And so
1,000%.
we talked about mindset potentially. Do we need to change senior directors' mindsets around what we're doing? We talked a little bit about confidence. But what we haven't really talked about, which I do go into detail quite a lot in my 8th book, which is the trust paradigm, is actually building trust within an organization. It's not just about collaboration, and it's not just about mindset, and it's not just about, if you look in this part of the world, we have Sharia law and we have Islamic law, where there's a much greater and higher level of value system here than there is in any other part of the world. And actually, I'd chosen to add that trust is higher in this region than it is in anywhere else in the world because it has that value system which other parts of the world don't possess. But then what I'm really trying to say is that economically and in terms of innovation, leadership it's not just about giving leadership a few more KPIs, it's about revolutionary change in order to make this paradigm shift for leaders and organizations to be well managed and to be well led. And it's not just geopolitical, it's supply chain management, it's tariff wars, we're creating a lot of war across all of the things that we've talked about. And there are very few leaders that have actually got serious leadership skills, attributes, and abilities to actually, as I said, not just maintain the organization, but I'm talking about taking the organization and leading the organization with fundamental shift in change that actually drives and pivots organization to a much higher level of performance growth and,
I
of
think
course, profitability.
I think the reality is that leadership is harder than it's ever been. I think for a number of factors. At the same time, great leadership is ever present in terms of its construct. And what I mean by that is we need to build leaders that can not only drive innovation, but recognize the more human-centric factors. So there's a lot of talk about technology at the moment, the disruptive forces in technology. I actually think it's a liberator for human potential. But you're right. Trust is the absolute fulcrum. I would also argue that courage is as well, because in big organizations to affect large scale transformational change, it does take courage. It does take breaking through silos. It does mean disrupting comfort. And to be courageous as a leader is not a comfortable path, right? We've been there. And I think to do that, you've got to have and instill real trust intentionally within your teams. And that's not easy for a lot of people that have, I would say outdated and outmoded ideas of what leadership is. Great leadership is about unleashing the potential of everyone around you, and that requires courage, that requires adaptive skills, it requires empathy, it really requires connection. And one of the things that I've always said to my teams is make a decision, own the decision, because ultimately 90% of decisions are reversible. Not all, but 90% of them are. The only thing I ever have a problem with is if people don't make a decision. You can only make a decision on the information that you have at any point in time. And the point that I'm making is that any kind of transformation requires real courage. And the smart organizations will be moving beyond trying to restore the past. They'll be thinking about redesigning their future. And where it takes courage, it always takes trust. Trust and courage are very, very similar. Because the smart organizations right now will be thinking about, okay, let's have a mirror moment. How can we challenge in the right way with kindness, where potentially we are weak in terms of our 5 areas of capital? Where do we need to build and buy capabilities? Are our capabilities up to the next iteration or evolution of the organization? And as perverse as it might sound, to talk about this kind of thing at this particular point in time where we are in the crisis. It's actually the responsibility and it's the courage of executive leadership teams to step into that zone, if you like. But it's also fundamentally about something that Geoff has written about and talked to me extensively on is, organizations do have a trust deposit, and that needs replenishing. Now, where organizations don't have that, now's the opportunity to start building that, because really trust is founded on so many different things, but ultimately it's about credibility, doing the right thing. It's about committing to take the organization forward. People need confidence and trust in their leaders, and people need to provide that. It's not just, there's been a lot of talk in leadership thinking for the last 10, 15 years around purpose, around meaning, around focus, around engagement. But all of these really do rest on a foundation of trust. And that's the big part that comes into question.
You
Or
make,
actually
you
comes
make
into the
you make
spotlight.
really good points there. I mean, we did a very large scale event last year in a place called Mansion House in London with
Hmm.
Wedlock Bell, the big law firm there.
Yeah.
Mark Tasker was the senior partner, gave us the floor. We had a very senior man from the military, senior people from government. I was speaking, and Kritika on oil and she was from the oil and gas and energy industry. She was also speaking. And what came out of it, because we was, there's a lot of noise online, unfortunately, and there's a lot of people now creating books from AI, as I said before, and I pride myself on purpose. But we've talked about the performance of trust, taking trust. Everyone's like, I'm going to teach you how to do big trust. Well, I'm afraid to say that's not good enough. You don't really understand how.
What even is that? I don't know what that
Well,
is.
good definition. I can tell you what the genesis of trust is because that's our trust model and that's our premise. So when we look at the genesis of trust, of course,
I get
we
that.
look at not perceived value, we look at increased value, we look at accelerated growth, we look at enhanced innovation, we look at improved collaboration, we look at stronger partnering, better execution, and heightened loyalty. Now, if you put all those together within a culture matrix, right? And you drive performance within your organization. I mean, some organizations now have actually deployed the services of a CT small r O officer, which is effectively the chief trust officer within the organization, because they recognize now that the chief trust officer has a very important role outside of the CPO, Chief People Officer, to actually embed trust as a financial KPI within the organization. And they have seen significant areas of growth as a direct result of applying trust into human-centered design within the canvas and drive, as I said, that growth. Not we're going to give you big inspired trust, because that has just open-ended words that don't have any meaning. And of course, what you're
Yeah,
doing when
1000%.
you're saying, I'm going to give you big trust, it's very motivational, I'm sure, but inspirational, I'm sure. But it's not going to make a blind bit of difference to the bottom line unless strategically you've integrated trust as a major part of the overall corporate strategy, one. But two, it's integrated with people, with humans, with technology, and more importantly, obviously, with design-led thinking process.
Mm.
At that point, you then, from a granular level, you've addressed the issues. And one of the other things you've got to think about with people, and I know you've got a big thing on this, David, is when you're doing any kind of transformation, you've got to
Hmm.
be cognizant of people's well-being, and more importantly, their mental health.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
that again is another issue. And they, what do employees look for? They look to their leaders, the leaders of an organization, because you can't really look at government as a good leadership tool, but except not all governments, but certain governments. You're looking at business leaders, how they behave. It's how
Yeah.
they behave with others. It's how they resonate with the vision, the mission, and the values within the
So
organization.
you've hit a really good point there, because one of the things that I've seen in the last week is certain leaders that I know personally, thinking that they can just flick a switch and demand trust from their organizations and their employees. And it really gets back to the work that you and Mark have done in terms of really getting to the bottom of what trust means, because a spotlight event, a crisis, like what we've got now, really does make you think about, so what are the pre-existing conditions for trust? Where do we draw from the well? And in my experience, it's not magic. It's really about authenticity and hard work. So there are really, I would say, 4 or 5 things that have to be in place. I think authentic, credible leadership that's consistent in their actions. That's one. So there's an authenticity. There's not a public versus a private face. I think credibility. People that understand their people that understand the business and are credible and capable to lead organizations and are consistent with the narrative that they espouse publicly. I think that's one really important factor. I think the other factor is when people experience a crisis, their leaders just start talking to them in a frequency and potentially with an openness that they've never seen before, and that can be a bit discombobulating, weirdly. So I think the organizations that thrive in a crisis, that have built trust with their employees, actually already practice regular, empathetic, transparent, open communication. So the people in the business know who they are. They know what's happening in the business. They know that all the activity that they're investing in, that they're working towards, has line of sight to the ultimate purpose of the organization. But I think there's 2 other factors that really do build trust. I think the first one, which I've alluded to, is real involvement in terms of decision making in and around the business. That's not just the old scientific approach to leadership of top down. It's top down, bottom up, and it's something I say to a lot of chief people officers and even CEOs. I say, why hire really smart people and then tell them what to do? It should be the other way around, right? There's the visibility factor, but I also think it's down to accountability. People, when they step into a leadership role, should know what it's really about. And there's a privilege, but there's also a responsibility that leaders have to understand if they're going to give direction, as they should, if they're going to ask people to operate in a code of conduct or in a way that espouses and lives and breathes the organizational values, then they should do the same. So I think there are 4 things that are really, really important. And the interesting thing is that aside from trust, a lot of organizations right now, and they have been since COVID and Ukraine especially, have been talking about organizational resilience, and have missed out quite a few things when it comes to the connection of the individual to the organization, but also trust. I know that you've got some interesting perspectives on resilience from an organizational standpoint, Geoff.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I've worked with a lot of the military around the world as well,
Yeah.
and so I've had the opportunity of working with the SEAL team, Delta Force, and the Green Beret, and obviously the good old good old Brits in the army. But um, when I want to take resiliency, I want to bring it back to geopolitical. I was invited to the chairpersons and also non-executive directors think tank in London, which was hosted at London Bridge by one of the big accounting firms called EY. A good friend of mine there because Ollie Jones, and Ollie has written a book on geopolitical strategy, and what he was doing was putting a lot of what geopolitical is into the environment. There must have been about 100 people there. Again, they're all chairs, all non-execs, for feedback and for questioning. And they had some very senior people, including Ollie, actually taking questions. And at this particular event as well, they invited, I don't know if you've heard of Lord Kim Durrock, who was the UK ambassador to America when Trump had version 1.0. It's some very interesting things to say as well about the president. Obviously, his when he walks into a room, how everybody must gratify him on his suit and his tie and his and everything he's doing is wonderful and good. And and when we sort of started to get back to resiliency, because that was a big topic of discussion at the event, it was clear that both at organizational level, senior management level, and even middle management level, there was very little resiliency. And what was the answer? So again, the answer was that, if you've got a chairperson who's done their fourth term and is at age 82, the person shouldn't really be taking the next term. It's about people that can inject that experience and that wisdom, as well as humility, empathy, and skill around the subjects that matter. And people are quite fragile. People need love, for a better word. People need to know that they're cared. And people also need to know that you're going to execute on everything they were sold at the interview. So that vision, that mission, and those set of values. But resiliency should be a part of culture. If you make it a part of culture, you take away the risk elements and you actually turn it into opportunity, because you create a collaboration around resiliency. You don't formalize it and put it into a risk management register and you keep it there and it's dormant. You bring it alive within the organization. And that way you can bring trust into the equation. And we get back to human-centered design at the center, well-being, okay, and resiliency, okay, and we then create business model innovation as a part of the process, instead of, oh, that's a resiliency. Who we got that knows about resiliency, right?
The
You put a
interesting
program
thing,
together, put a program and some frameworks together. No, you're not going to put standardized frameworks together around such an important topic like resiliency. I mean, in addition to all the things we've talked about, resiliency also covers cybersecurity, and we know the issues there, covers a lot of different facets on and around the business, which are important to the business today. However, from a people perspective, because I still believe that human intelligence together with technology and process is what drives organizations, and that bit is not going to change. The bottlenecks and the lack of productivity in the world, which we've already discussed, it still sits at $8.9 trillion, which is, again, a substantial amount of GDP, about 11% of GDP, and it's more than Amazon, Apple, and Google's turnover all put together, is a big problem. Toxic behavior within just the US in terms of business within the US sits at about 226 billion a year, with people having to take time out and stress and mental health and failure within US business. It's not a world figure, that's just the US alone. So resiliency changes a completely different playing field in terms of how you approach the business. More importantly, how you approach your people within that business, because you do have to create psychological safety. You do have to create well-being. And when we create psychological safety and well-being, of course, that brings in trust at that point. And in that authenticity you talked about, that transparency of openness that you talk about, and of course, what does that create? Collaboration.
I think, let me just go back to something I said that was really interesting, that you said that was really interesting. It alludes to how organizations view resilience, right? And often when I've been sat down with senior leadership teams, either doing business continuity planning or talking about resilience, it's often looked at in two very, very different ways. There's what I call the operational view, which is what's our financial assets, our built assets, our social capital, our brand capital, what's our financial position, very operational, all important in terms of the continuity of the business. And then you've got the other perspective, which is personal resilience. And in essence, they're interconnected. They're two sides of the same coin. Because when you think about it, the traditional view of organizational resilience is the ability of an entity and organization to absorb a shock, adapt, and go on after the crisis. Personal resilience has been diminished in terms of an individual's ability to cope, adapt, grow, perhaps from some form of adversity. And in reality, resilience is a factor of both
It
sides
is,
of the
but there
coin.
is one other factor you haven't, I don't know if you've thought about, but obviously we have seen
Well,
an increase in conduct risk. Okay.
but
Um,
1,000%.
right,
The
right.
the issue that the point that I'm making is that resilient people strengthen organizations, and good organizations build resilient people. So there's a cycle effect. And I think the more and more organizations are understanding resilience and I think it's these kind of disruptions, these type of events that force them to do that. They're adopting more of a human-centric approach to running their organizations, but at the same time, they're being more systems mindseted in terms of how can we genuinely be more agile? How can we genuinely build psychological safety?
Right,
How
but
do we
those
develop?
conversations should be taking place before the event. They should be planning groups to actually have those discussions, not
Absolutely,
not an
absolutely.
afterthought when the event has actually
Yeah,
taken
thousand
place.
percent, 1,000%. I think what it enables people to do is develop a number of advantages before the threat, for sure. The ability to anticipate and prepare. I think it's sometimes called the cushioning effect, but withstanding that initial shock. But that agility and adaptability, people, systems, structures that can respond and still perform through a crisis. And then you've got the imagination, the innovation, the shaping elements. How do we actually look at where we are now in our wider environment? What does it mean for our organization? And I think the organizations that do have trust, do have the courage to lead with that vulnerability, will be the ones that do ask the harder questions, that are capable of confronting some potentially uncomfortable truths, but will engage meaningfully, not through a pulse survey, not through a town hall, but actually have genuine conversations that are really transparent, that are really intentional. And all of these things are fundamentally founded on trust. because you cannot enter a room as a CEO and ask people to say, hey, what do you think of this? What's working? Where are we not working so well? What do we need to improve? Unless you've got the absolute foundation of trust and the absolute obligation that you've committed to your people, that you want genuine discourse, you want genuine feedback, then as an organization, you're in trouble. You really are in trouble. And as you say, Geoff, ultimately, these things can't be flicked on like a switch. They're earned over time. They really are. And I think if organizations don't have them, they better start putting that work in right now, because as we've seen 3 big global affecting crises, and is what 2026 now. So yeah, these kinds of things, these kind of quote unquote black swan events, they're part of doing business at the moment. So I think organizations need to use these crises as opportunities to not only improve the financial, the performance results of their organizations, but also improve the lives of the people in the communities which they serve, and that includes their employees as well. That's my personal take on what combining trust with courage is all about.
Yeah, I think there's one other important factor here is that, for CFOs, I mean, we constantly hear it, the panic attacks, and it's like, no, we need to do immediate minimization because, we've got some action in the Middle East or whatever.
Yeah.
They're not thinking laterally. And it is hard to forecast in such circumstances now, and scenario planning becomes greater and greater. But if you actually have a forecast which is built on belief and confidence and trust, you're not talking minimization, after 2 weeks of an event in the Middle East. What you're looking at is the duration of the next year and what prevention strategies or what strategies do need to take place. But minimization should be the last discussion, because what will happen, they'll start minimizing, they'll start reducing staff salaries, they demotivate staff, they actually put more erosions of trust within the organization. There's layoffs, and then before you know it, within a month or so, they're re-recruiting, and then there's all of the training costs, there's all of the culture, there's all of the person fit scenario going in, and also not to mention the expense of going through a process like minimization. We need to start thinking clearer. And I think the words that you talked about around resiliency and around trust, we need that more at senior level. And we shouldn't be just literally panicking and making minimization a part of structure within the organization. It's a bit like micromanagement in the same way that is a really bad effective strategy. It's okay for high risk short term, but not long term. It creates a very toxic culture within the organization. In the same way, without trust, without resiliency, most organizations are going to suffer.
Big time. I think the sad reality is that sometimes that very short-sighted approach to these events does happen, but ultimately that's down to the leadership capability and strength of the executive team ultimately, and about being human at the same time. You can take an action in a certain scenario that's very short term, and it might feel like the right thing to do there and then, but you can often do more damage than good by just looking at the here and now. And really, leaders at a certain level need to be trained on how to weigh up a task, the time, the importance at hand, and the team available to make that effective decision. So, clarity on the identity of an organization, what its people mean, what its mission is, are all important. But how the executive leadership level view themselves and their role and their relationship with the organization and staff really comes into these situations, and it can't just be looking on a financial forecast or a quarter balance sheet. It just can't be. That's my personal opinion, and I think the right one.
I'm talking now. This is the least I've ever spoken on a podcast. I just didn't think I could add much to the conversation at all. But I like the thing about the comment about the courage and stuff and trust. But the question is, to trust requires bravery, because we're risking something.
Sure.
So I think that is partly we need to trust the people we work with, and we need to trust the environment to make.
I think what you're describing, Scott, is boldness in leadership.
Absolutely. But I think I agree with what you're saying. So the more those foundations are in place, the less bold it feels to do this.
1,000%.
And therefore it's easier to do, and therefore it requires less courage because it's more natural and small things. So if we've got all these systems in place, and we do encourage that people to challenge, people to question, people to look, where's the opportunities, and we have that going on all the time. And when we get an event, it's just a continuation of that process.
Exactly. I used to work for a fintech in London, and we had a genuinely existential crisis to deal with one of our partners who our software effectively ran the business from folding. And we had less than 72 hours to uncouple everything, find a new partner, and keep business continuity going as much as possible. And that took literally about 30 people in this organization. I was one of them, working all weekend to ensure that customers knew what was happening, testing various products that we had. And the only reason we emerged was simply down to the trust dividend that we'd built up, the belief that the organizational leadership was going to do the right thing, that we were capable of doing what we said. Crazy enough to believe that we could do it in the first place. But ultimately, that for me was one of the most pivotal learning experiences in my career as a leader, because it really showed beyond the textbooks, beyond the buzzwords, if you do this right, it really can be unbelievably profound. And I think it's a great way of looking at it. Bold leadership is required, but if you get a lot of these things in place, really bold actions don't seem as bold. That's a brilliant way of looking at it.
It's just less, because we are risk averse, so make it less risky by making it natural. And then it's okay. So I read an interesting book called Be Less Zombie by a guy called Elvin Turner. He talks about Black Swan events and stuff, and one of the things he talks about is the things come into like the cupboards when things start going wrong. Organizations looking at innovation cupboard. What have we got in here? But if they've not done innovation as a process, then they're really working on the back foot. Whereas companies that can innovate and have a cupboard full and a pipeline that's going. So when things happen, it's just a change, maybe a focus, change of process and stuff. But the building blocks.
Back to Jeff's point, to really have innovation as part of your DNA in an organization, you really do have to have trust in place.
And
but it's okay to fail. It's all right. It's part of the process.
Failing is learning.
Yep, 1,000%.
Yeah, I'm talking, funny enough, about boldness and resiliency with trust in Mark and I's new book, which have been book number 9 for me, which we're starting in May, funny enough. So I'm very excited about that, because I think there is a massive, imagine what you said, Scott. Imagine you've got people around the management table who are risk adverse, totally risk adverse, and you've got some that are moderate on risk, and actually you've got some which are very bold and want to move forward. Depending if it's designed by committee, that's going to be a very interesting scenario. If it's more C-suite led, then you're going to get a lot of different perspectives, which are going to create a great debate and hopefully make a better decision. But at board level, more importantly, A lot of boards just vote on design by committee, and in some regards, that's negative. It's using the boldness to navigate through stiff terrains. I actually believe that what we're experiencing now geopolitically, and actually with regards to tariffs and whatever the next regime is, the tax here, or the supply chains here, or I think this is a part of a new era of a new world that is constant. It's not about another event. It's a constant wheel of notional change. And some will be less severe and some will be incredibly severe. And we need mindsets of people that possess all the skills, okay, and not skills from the past, because the skills of the past will cause failure within organizations, and it will mean that decisions are not being made, in regard to the best for the state, for the shareholders, and the best for the investors, and more importantly, best for business performance. So I think it is about having a truly more experienced group of people on boards, as with the C-suite, who possess the wisdom, and they don't look constantly for AI for the answer, because that's not going to get you through commercially through some of the big obstacles and challenges that we find ourselves within.
Okay. So
it's interesting that Geoff mentions AI. I think that's another big trust factor as well. At the moment, as we know, a lot of people in a lot of different professions are very nervous about what AI means for them, their profession, their job in 5-10 years. And I think it's fundamentally down to organizations to build trust in this way, in terms of really being clear in terms of, we're looking at AI, we're looking at that and other disruptive technologies with a rational head. It is viewed correctly as a tool, not as a replacement. And we're going to work with you and take you on that journey. Now, given what Geoff's just said in terms of all the other paradigms around disruption that will exist and will continue, it's fundamentally important that organizations enable their leaders in systemic ways, but also in, I would say, very practical ways, to develop their leaders to engender meaningful trust, to have open, sometimes difficult conversations, because unless leaders can actually understand the power of trust and what trust truly means, what its building blocks are, I think we're going to have real issues in organizations, worse than we've seen before. I really believe that.
I think it's interesting. I think the Alderman did a recent, or a couple of years ago, about AI and implementation of AI in tech. And the two key things that came out for higher levels of adoption of AI is people trusting the motives behind the why it's been implemented, and secondly, the capabilities of people for the oversight.
1000%, yeah.
So those
and it's
two key.
It's about critical thinking. Yeah, it's critical thinking ultimately, and yeah, it has a massive effect on people's lives. Absolutely. And I'm not sure how I would feel about certain politicians taking those decisions right now. I'm not sure how I feel about certain politicians making decisions related to this crisis. But trust, like psychological safety, like courage, too often they're used as buzzwords, but actually that they are incredibly important constructs that do have material performance, well-being, and absolute business importance. They really, really do.
Absolutely. Okay, gents. So we're winding this one down. So what I'll just go a little round table thing. So we've talked about how do we lead through geopolitical tensions that we're experiencing now, and it's been an interesting debate. Listen to your viewpoints. So if we can sum this up in a couple of sentences, what would it be? Who would like to go first? I normally leave Geoff for last because he likes the last word.